There was a morning in May 1527 when the most sacred city in the Western Christian world woke to a sound it had not heard in over 1,000 years, the sound of an army inside its walls that had not come to protect it. And what makes this morning uniquely, almost cosmically obscene in the history of European civilization is the identity of that army. Because the soldiers who poured through the breached walls of Rome on May 6, 1527, were not Turks or Mongols or the armies of some rival faith. They were the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the man whose title literally meant defender of Christendom, Spanish Tercios, and German Landsknecht mercenaries who had not been paid in months, and who fell upon the city of the Papacy with a hunger and a fury that contemporaries on every side described with the specific vocabulary of apocalypse. And the smell that settled over Rome in the days that followed was the smell of burning archives and looted sacristies, and something that had no material source. The smell of an idea about power and sanctity and divine protection collapsing so completely that the men who survived it wrote about it for the rest of their lives as the moment they understood that the world they had been born into was finished, and the question scorched into the cobblestones of Rome by 9 months of systematic plunder is not how this happened. The military mechanics are documented with damning precision. The question is what the sack of Rome reveals about the relationship between institutional sacred authority and raw political power, when the distance between them finally collapses to zero. The road to the sack of Rome ran through the specific dysfunction of Italian Renaissance geopolitics and the personal vanity of Pope Clement VII, a Medici pope of genuine intellectual sophistication and catastrophic political judgment. Because the Italian Peninsula in the 1520s was the primary theater of the conflict between Francis the Year of France and the Emperor Charles V for dominance of Europe, and Clement had spent years attempting to play these two colossi against each other with the finesse that Italian statecraft had developed across 2 centuries of smaller-scale balance of power politics. And what he consistently failed to understand was that the scale of the conflict had exceeded the toolkit he was using to manage it. And in 1526, he joined the League of Cognac with France and several Italian states against Charles, a decision whose strategic logic was defensible in the abstract and catastrophic in the specific, because Charles' forces in northern Italy, under the command of the Constable of Bourbon, were already dangerously undersupplied and underpaid, and holding together through a combination of military discipline and the promise of eventual compensation. And when that compensation failed to materialize and Bourbon lost control of his army's collective decision-making, what replaced strategic command was something older and more primal, the logic of an army that has decided to pay itself, and Rome, the richest city in Italy, lay between them and the horizon. The Constable of Bourbon died on a scaling ladder at the walls of Rome on the morning of May 6th, shot by a musket ball at the moment of the breach, in circumstances so dramatically appropriate that contemporaries immediately suspected the hand of Providence. And his death did not stop the assault, it accelerated it, because the death of the commander removed the last human brake on what the army had already decided to do, and the troops that poured through the wall found before them a city that had spent decades accumulating the artistic and financial wealth of the most powerful religious institution in Western civilization, and that had made essentially no serious provision for its own military defense. And what followed across the next 9 months has been described by the historian Judith Hook and others as one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the Renaissance period, not because contemporaries lacked the language to describe it, but because so many of them had the education and the literary culture to describe it precisely, and the German Landsknechts, many of whom were Lutheran and who had been raised on Martin Luther's rhetoric about Rome as the whore of Babylon, attacked the city's churches and monasteries with an ideological enthusiasm that went beyond simple looting. They dressed in stolen papal vestments and staged mock papal processions, and conducted what amounted to a physical performance of everything Luther had said about Roman corruption, theology enacted through desecration. The uncomfortable excavation that the sack of Rome demands is the excavation of Clement VII himself, because the triumphalist narrative of papal victimhood that the Catholic tradition constructed around 1527 requires Clement to be a martyr figure, the innocent head of Christendom assaulted by the ungrateful troops of a nominally Catholic emperor. And this narrative is not false, but it is profoundly incomplete, because Clement's political decisions in the years preceding the sack were not the decisions of an innocent shepherd, but of an aggressive political player who had consistently overestimated his leverage and underestimated his opponents, and the institutional corruption of the Renaissance papacy that Luther had been describing since 1517, the sale of offices and indulgences, the nepotism that had given Clement himself his position, the accumulation of political and financial power that had transformed the Bishop of Rome into an Italian prince who happened to also be a religious leader. That corruption was real, documented. And the German soldiers who mocked it in the streets of Rome were performing a critique that a significant portion of European Christianity had already concluded was legitimate, And Charles IV, who was formerly horrified by the sack, and who later did public penance for it, had simultaneously done nothing in the critical weeks when intervention might have prevented it, a passivity so convenient for his political interests that historians have debated for centuries whether it was genuine helplessness or calculated indifference. What the sack of Rome ended was not the papacy. The institution survived and eventually recovered, and the counter-reformation that followed produced a papacy of genuine spiritual and organizational seriousness that the Renaissance papacy had never been, but what it ended was the specific configuration of papal power as a fully independent geopolitical actor, capable of playing the great powers of Europe against each other from a position of genuine leverage, because after 1527, every pope for generations understood with a visceral and institutional clarity that the protection of the papal states depended ultimately on the goodwill of secular powers that the papacy could influence but never control, and the Reformation that Luther had launched in 1517 found in the sack of Rome its most powerful piece of propaganda, not because Luther designed it that way, but because the image of imperial Catholic troops looting the Vatican spoke more directly to the Protestant critique of Roman corruption than any theological treatise Luther ever wrote. And today, the Via della Conciliazione leading to St. Peter's Square is lined with the architecture of a papacy that rebuilt itself from the ruins of 1527 into something more durable, if also more circumscribed. And the tourists who photograph the square have no idea they are standing in the footprint of a catastrophe. The cobblestones remember nothing. And the question that the gutted palaces and the looted sacristies of that 9-month nightmare are still asking, from beneath the Renaissance facade that was eventually restored over them, is the question that every institution which claims sacred authority while exercising secular power must eventually face, which is this: when the army you theoretically command turns on the city you theoretically sanctify. Which of your two roles failed you, and is there any honest answer that does not implicate both?